Section 6-2 deals with European colonies in Africa during the era of imperialism. This map shows the layout of Africa in 1914. And as you can see, it's really controlled by these 7 European countries. In 1914, almost the entire continent was colonized, with the small exceptions of Ethiopia. But before we jump into this section, it says here that Africa is a huge continent, nearly three times the size of Europe, with diverse regions and culture, before the scramble for Africa. And with just that bit of a sentence right there, I think it's really important, especially as students of history, to always stop and think about the danger of a single story. I really encourage people to check out this TED Talk by Adichi. She talks about the dangers of a single stories, and in terms of ninth grade world history in English or in Ohio, we talk about Africa immediately being colonized by European countries. But what about everything that happened before the scramble for Africa? Adichie writes that the problems with stereotypes is not that they were untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And as a freshman in Ohio, growing up, at least for our state standards, if you're being presented really, for the first time, you learn about African civilizations as a sixth and seventh grader, but you probably forgot about them by the time you're a freshman. And then all of a sudden you're viewing Africa as this huge, diverse continent that was just colonized by European countries. Is that your only story then of Africa, as Africa being a place that fell to European countries and was colonized for, almost in some cases 100 years? Then that's the danger of it. So I always tell my students to think about everything that happened like in Africa before 1914. This is important history, but we do have to go back and say, well, what about what happened before? So I return again to King Leopold's Ghost, great book, where we talk about in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we saw, in effect, a group of people who had different forms of birth control. We talked about in Congo where they had baskets, mats, pottery, cotton, ironwork, and we saw that all of this was remarkable and it was different. And we saw too how this will later impact European culture as well too. So we say, you have an illustration of a mask that was found in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or what is now the Congo, and this will influence Picasso. We can see the striking similarities of this. So don't think of this section as saying Africa was victim to European colonization and loss, but it's part of a story, but it's not the only story. So what happened prior to European colonization in Africa? I wrote down too that Africa is nearly 3 times the size of Europe, and almost the entire continental United States can fit inside just the Sahara, which again shows you just how large of a continent Africa is. So there's so many different things going on across Africa throughout this section then too. Prior to European colonization, which really starts to begin around 1820, 1830, parts of East and North Africa were still controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which was weakening at the time due to ineffective rulers. The Ottoman Empire will collapse in 1918 following World War I, but it was already weakened at this point, which allowed European countries to step in and fill the void. Usman de Fodio ruled what was the Sokoto Caliphate in what is present-day Nigeria, and issued new laws and changes for Islamic practices, and new Muslim states emerged in this part of Africa. We saw, beginning with after the Prophet Muhammad died in 710, Islam had a vast expansion across North Africa and into the Middle East, and it even made its way down into what is, again, present-day Nigeria. So there was changes and new states that were emerging in that part of Africa. And Kilwa and Mombasa in present-day Kenya linked in the East Africa to the Middle East as well. Port cities along the coast still had the imports and exports to parts of, again, the Middle East and India as well too. And Southern Africa in the 1800s was ruled by Shaka and dominated by the Zulu Wars. This is a European depiction of Shaka, a fierce war leader who occupied territories in the south of Africa. The Zulus would eventually be defeated by the Boers. The Boers were the descendants of Dutch-speaking settlers. We'll see too that Dutch settlements occurred, especially in South Africa, and still had a major impact in that country. That's a brief depiction of Africa before the colonization happened. So again, Europe and Africa before around 1880. Slavery was orchestrated along the coasts. Here we saw in earlier units how European countries would utilize West African kingdoms to orchestrate the slave trade along these coastal cities. Before that too, we saw eventually in 1787 Sierra Leone was created as a colony by the British for former slaves. Also Liberia in 1847, former slaves from the United States established that state. But European understanding of Africa was still somewhat questionable because for a variety of reasons, European explorers, later settlers and merchants weren't able to really penetrate inside the insides of Africa for a variety of reasons. Geography, diseases, they weren't able to withstand the climate, the humidity, and malaria was prevalent. So European knowledge of Africa was, again, quite questionable really before 1880. But we'll see that changes with the advancement of the Industrial Revolution with medicine allowed Europeans to eventually begin to kind of explore Africa and see what it was like as a continent. David Livingstone and Henry Stanley have these famous encounters as they're exploring Africa, where there's the famous remark from Henry Stanley. They meet David Livingstone. He says, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," which is kind of metaphorical. Two European explorers exploring a continent. They have fascinating accounts of what they thought was right and wrong. But the Africa is starting to come into the picture. Again, I use the example in the other video. The Industrial Revolution is it forces the world together, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. We'll see brutal aspects that will happen later in the section, though, too. Still, also, as this is occurring, as it's forcing the world together, we still have many Westerners who took paternalistic views of Africans, meaning they saw them as children in need of guidance. To them, African cultures and religions were degraded, and they urged Africans to reject their own traditions in favor of Western civilization. So this is, again, that danger of a single story. Much of African culture and religion was lost and destroyed in this time period too. So we need to acknowledge again that we're at this point in history looking at the continent of Africa as it was colonized, but that neglects the countless amounts of history that existed before this section. In 1884, there was something called the Berlin Conference, which we'll get into this. This is when European countries met in Berlin to decide how to partition Africa equally and fairly. This should probably make you a little bit upset as you're reading this in 2023. This pen is not working very well. No representatives from any African nations or cultures or states were in attendance. If a European country wanted to claim a part of Africa, it simply needed to set up a government office in the required land. 20 years later, the entire African continent was nearly partitioned. European countries saw Africa as a location for raw materials, which they could then bring back to their markets or to their factories, and they could then utilize and become more wealthy and more prosperous. International outrage occurred after understanding what King Leopold II of Belgium encouraged and was now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congo is probably where some of these atrocities were the worst. Again, King Leopold's ghost is a great account. Slavery was rampant. Rubber was extracted from the country and sent back to Belgium. And the stories are absolutely depressing and should make you frustrated and should make you upset. Slavery existed. Families were tortured, mutilated, and the practices that occurred here were just terrible to think about. The French, as you see here, took huge portions of North Africa. The British took areas in East Africa. Egypt here eventually is where the Suez Canal will be constructed, which would link the ability for shipping to occur and to go from the Mediterranean Sea down via the Red Sea down into the Indian Ocean. This would create more opportunities for commerce. The British merchant Cecil Rhodes often dreamed of connecting the Cape of Good Hope to Cairo in Egypt again. So railways, we'll see, were huge in India and also in Africa as well. There's also the Boer War, which lasted in 1899 to 1902 in southern Africa as well. So there was some destabilization as European countries were again carving up different parts of Africa. I get a student who often asks then too, like, why didn't they fight back? Well, they did. Why didn't different areas in Africa resist? We saw that the Industrial Revolution brought new weapons again into the fold, which made it really a story of the haves and the have-nots. Someone described to me as Avatar, the way of imperialism. So some of the examples of resistance then too. Sama Touré fought against the French forces in parts of Algeria in the north then too. I have to make sure I pronounce the name correctly. This is showing my ignorance, but Yaawa Asatewa united the Asante Empire against British rule too. She was a female who would unite them against the British, but the resistance was often futile. In present-day Zimbabwe, Nahanda united the Shona people and encouraged revolts against the British rule. So these were two female African rulers who were uniting against the British then too. And there were also revolts in Ethiopia, but really Africa would again, as you saw on that map, by 1914 be partitioned and really wouldn't start to receive independence until really the 1960s, 70s in the post-war era. So this brings us to, again, one of our bigger questions. How do we live with the consequences of imperialism within history? At the time of this video, everybody that united or partitioned those portions of Africa, of course, they're all dead. It's multiple generations ago. But as we can see, we're still living with this history, and we're still living with European colonization of Africa. So how, of course, there are positive impacts, but there, as we saw most evident in the Congo, incredibly negative impacts. So what is to be done? We live with the history and we inherit that history, and we have to ask ourselves again, what role do we play today in 2023 in trying to ensure for a more prosperous world? Africa is the youngest continent in the world. Africa is also the fastest growing continent in the world. And we should really be mindful, and we should watch Africa, which is a continent full of diverse kingdoms and cultures and people, and to see what will happen next.